We all love a good rags to riches story, right? Like the underdog who beats the odds, climbs the ladder,
Yeah.
Achieves the American dream.
Yeah, definitely.
But how often does that actually happen? It seems like those stories are way more captivating than they are common.
Right.
What if I told you that the system itself is like a huge E factor in where we end up, not just our hard work or talent?
Absolutely.
Sociologists call this social stratification.
It's true.
Think of it like society is a giant invisible game board where some players start with advantages built right into the rules.
It's less about blaming individuals and more about understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
The patterns that play out across generations and different groups.
So it's not just about individual effort.
Sure.
It's about this whole system at play.
Right.
And that's what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah.
We've got excerpts from a sociology textbook chapter.
Yeah.
All about social stratification.
Okay, cool.
We'll define it. Look at how it works in the U.S. Zoom out to a global view and even tackle some of the major theories behind it all.
Sounds like quite the deep dive.
Ready to decode the hidden layers of society.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so the chapter starts with this cool analogy, rock strata.
Okay.
Those layers you see in a cliff face,
Yeah.
each layer is different, right?
Yeah.
Made up of unique minerals formed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, social stratification is kind of like that, except instead of rocks, it's groups of people. And those layers represent unequal access to resources.
Resources meaning things like wealth, income, education, even power. And your position within those layers, that's your socioeconomic status, or SES.
Okay, so the American dream says everyone has an equal shot, but this stratification thing throws a wrench in that idea. It's like saying the game is fair when some players start with extra tokens and get to roll twice.
Right.
It's like some people are starting the race a mile behind everyone else.
That's why sociologists study this. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding the forces at play that shape individual outcomes. Take first-generation college students, for example. Did you know that a staggering 89% of them don't graduate within 6 years?
Wow, 89%. That's really disheartening. You'd think with all the talk about equal opportunity, that number would be much lower.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear sign that your background influences your chances, even if you're incredibly talented and driven.
Okay, so the chapter talks about two main types of stratification systems,
Okay.
closed and open. I'm guessing closed isn't exactly known for encouraging upward mobility.
Right. A closed system is very rigid. You're pretty much stuck in the social position you're born into with little chance of changing your status. A classic example, though, a controversial one, is the Indian caste system.
Interesting.
Though officially dismantled, it's a fascinating case study because it shows just how deeply embedded these systems can be in a society's culture and beliefs.
So to closed system, your destiny is pretty much pre-programmed, like those old school elevators where you can't switch floors once the doors close.
Exactly.
What about open systems then?
Open systems like class systems allow for more movement.
Okay.
Your social factors still matter, but individual achievement plays a role too.
So that's where we get ideas like climbing the social ladder or breaking the cycle of poverty.
Exactly. And this is where terms like exogamous marriage come into play. In open systems, you can marry someone from a different class, shaking things up a bit. Of course, there's still often pressure toward endogamous marriage, staying within your class, but at least there's the option for more fluidity.
Right. And then there's this whole idea of a meritocracy where effort equals reward. Sounds like a level playing field.
Uh-huh.
But is it really that simple?
Yeah.
I mean, are we truly judged solely on our merits? Or are there other factors at play?
That's the big question. It's an ideal, a utopian vision of a perfectly fair society.
Okay.
But in reality, things are way more complicated. There are always going to be factors beyond just merit that influence a person's social standing.
Okay, so let's get specific about the U.S.
Okay.
We tend to talk about upper, middle, and lower classes, but how do we actually define those categories?
Yeah.
It seems like everyone claims to be middle class, even if their lifestyles and incomes are vastly different.
It does get messy. And honestly, a lot of it comes down to wealth, not just income.
Right.
It's the total value of what you own your assets minus any debts. And what's key here is that wealth can be passed down through generations, which can solidify those class distinctions over time.
Okay, that makes sense. So that explains why so many people identify as middle class, even if they're making $150,000 a year
Right.
or $30,000. Are we all just in denial about our actual social standing?
Not necessarily. There are different ways to define middle class, and it's not always about hard numbers. Some researchers look at income percentiles, while others focus on lifestyle factors or even cultural values.
So where does our listener fit into all of this? The Pew Research Center puts the middle class between $48,500 and $500 per year. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
That's a great question for our listener to ponder.
Yeah, and more importantly, what does that number really tell us about your social standing and the opportunities available to you?
And keep in mind, those income ranges are just a starting point. The cost of living varies wildly across the country.
Right.
So what's considered middle class in one area might be very different in another. It's less about the number itself and more about what that number allows you to do,
Okay.
the choices it affords you, and the level of security it provides.
Now let's talk about the upper class. This is where the power really lies.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about the 1%, the folks who control a third of the nation's wealth.
Yeah.
That kind of concentration of wealth must translate into a huge amount of influence.
It absolutely does. And that influence extends far beyond just financial matters. Think about corporate decisions, media ownership, even philanthropy.
Right.
They shape the landscape of our society in ways that most of us can only imagine.
Yeah.
They set the agenda, influence public opinion, and have access to resources and networks that are simply unavailable to most people.
And then there's the whole old money versus new money dynamic.
Right.
Is it really different being born into wealth versus earning it yourself?
There's definitely a distinction. Old money comes with generations of social knowledge, connections, and access to elite institutions. It's not just about the money itself, it's about a whole way of life.
Okay.
A set of values and experiences that are passed down through families.
So it's not just about having a fat bank account.
Right.
It's about understanding the unspoken rules of the game, having the right connections, and knowing how to navigate those elite circles. Whereas new money can be a bit flashier. Think of those reality shows with the mansions and sports cars.
Exactly. New money might attract attention, but it doesn't automatically grant you access to those same social circles or cultural capital. There's a learning curve, a process of assimilation, and sometimes that clash of cultures becomes part of the story itself.
It's like that saying, money talks, but wealth whispers. New money shouts from the rooftops, while old money operates with a quiet confidence and an understanding of the nuances of power. It's fascinating how these distinctions play out in a supposedly open system. Now let's dive into the middle class, the supposed backbone of American society. We hear about the shrinking middle class all the time, but what does that actually mean?
It means that the percentage of Americans who fall into that middle income bracket is declining. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening, leaving fewer people in that middle ground.
And why should our listener care about that?
Well, a strong middle class is often seen as a sign of a healthy economy.
Right.
It means more people have disposable income, which drives consumer spending and economic growth. A shrinking middle class can lead to economic instability, social unrest, and a decline in the overall quality of life for many Americans. It also raises questions about social mobility and whether the American dream is truly attainable for most people.
Okay, so a shrinking middle class could have ripple effects throughout society, impacting everything from economic growth to social mobility. Let's break down this middle class a bit further. We've got the lower middle class and the upper middle class. What distinguishes these two groups?
The lower middle class typically includes folks with some college education or associate's degrees. They often work in technical or administrative roles and have more prestige and income than the lower class.
Okay.
But they're still vulnerable to economic downturns and might struggle to save for retirement or their children's education.
They're kind of stuck in this precarious position where they're doing okay,
Right.
but one unexpected expense or job loss could send them tumbling down the ladder.
Exactly.
What about the upper middle class? They seem to be living the dream, right?
They're certainly more comfortable. They tend to have postgraduate degrees, work in professional fields like business law or medicine, and own their homes. They can afford vacations, invest in their children's futures, and generally enjoy a higher quality of life. But even they aren't immune to the pressures of a changing economy. The cost of living is rising, job security isn't always a given, and many feel like they're working harder than ever just to stay afloat.
So even the dream comes with its own set of anxieties and challenges. It's like that saying, the more money you make, the more money you need. Your expenses and expectations tend to rise along with your income. Now let's shift our focus to the lower class, often referred to as the working class. This group seems to be hit hardest by economic downturns and systemic inequalities.
That's right. And within this group, there are further distinctions: the working class, the working poor, and the underclass. Each faces its own unique set of challenges.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. What characterizes the working class?
The working class is often employed in blue-collar jobs that are physically demanding but lack the prestige and income of professional careers. They might work in factories, construction, or service industries. They tend to value hard work and self-reliance, but often feel overlooked or undervalued by society.
Their jobs are essential, keeping our society running, yet they often struggle to make ends meet and lack access to the same opportunities as those in higher classes. What about the working poor? How are they different?
The working poor face even greater challenges. They might work full-time or even hold multiple jobs, but still struggle to afford basic necessities like housing, food, and healthcare. They often lack benefits like paid sick leave or health insurance, making them incredibly vulnerable to financial hardship.
It's a harsh reality, especially when you consider that the real value of the minimum wage has actually dropped significantly over the past few decades. It's not keeping up with inflation, and the living wage, what you actually need to survive, varies drastically depending on where you live.
Exactly. And then there's the underclass, a term that can be controversial because it can feel stigmatizing, but it generally refers to those who are chronically unemployed, often living in poverty and relying on government assistance. They might face multiple barriers to employment, such as lack of education, job skills, transportation, or childcare. They often live in neighborhoods with high crime rates and limited access to resources.
It's a complex and challenging situation, and it's easy to fall into stereotypes about those who are struggling. It's important to remember that every individual has their own story, their own reasons for being in their current situation. We need to avoid those simplistic narratives that blame individuals for their circumstances and instead focus on the systemic factors that contribute to poverty and inequality.
Absolutely. We need to look at the bigger picture, understanding how factors like discrimination, lack of access to education and healthcare, and a changing economy contribute to these challenges.
It reminds me of the story of Mariano Rivera, the legendary baseball pitcher who made his first glove out of cardboard because his family couldn't afford a real one. It's an inspiring story of resilience and determination, but it also highlights the systemic barriers that make those successes statistically less likely for those born into the lower class.
That's such a powerful example. It's a reminder that talent and ambition exist in every social class, but not everyone has the same opportunities to cultivate those gifts.
So we've talked about these different class categories,
Yeah.
but are they really that clear-cut? Do clothes, cars, hobbies really reveal your social standing?
Yeah.
The chapter introduces this idea of class traits or markers,
Right.
but can we actually judge a book by its cover?
It's tempting to stereotype, but it's important to remember that those lines are blurring as class distinctions become less rigid.
Yeah.
You might have a factory worker who's also a gourmet chef.
Right.
Or a billionaire who wears ripped jeans.
Right. And even celebrities play with those expectations. There are plenty of examples of super wealthy stars who are known for their frugality or their love of public transport. Jennifer Lopez was photographed in a $30 dress, and Lady Gaga once tweeted about using coupons.
It's a reminder that individuals are complex and their social standing doesn't always dictate every aspect of their lives.
So those external markers might not tell the whole story. But what about social mobility? Is it really possible to move up or down the class ladder in a system that seems so stacked against certain groups?
That's where we get into the debate about the American dream and whether it's still attainable. Social mobility refers to the ability to move up or down the class ladder.
Okay.
And while upward mobility is often celebrated, downward mobility is a reality for many Americans, especially in times of economic uncertainty.
So job loss, divorce, illness, those can all contribute to a decline in social standing, regardless of your talent or work ethic. And on the flip side, education, a lucky break, or even marrying someone with a higher income can boost you up the ladder.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, and understanding those dynamics helps us see how social forces and individual choices interact to shape a person's trajectory.
So far, we've been focused on the U.S., but how does this all play out on a global scale? Is the American dream even a relevant concept in other parts of the world?
That's where we move into the realm of global stratification. We're talking about comparing entire countries in terms of their wealth, power, and economic stability. It's a whole other level of complexity, and it challenges us to think beyond our own national borders.
The chapter mentions that industrialization played a huge role in creating global inequalities. It created a gap between those who embraced technology and those who didn't.
That's right. The Industrial Revolution led to unprecedented wealth in Western Europe and North America.
Right.
But it also left many other countries behind, creating a divide that persists to this day.
And I remember learning about first world, second world, and third world countries, but the chapter says that model is outdated. What are we using now?
Those terms are too simplistic and often based on Cold War politics.
Okay.
Newer models talk about more developed versus less developed nations based on factors like GDP and standard of living. But even those terms can be problematic because they imply a linear progression that doesn't always reflect reality.
Okay, so how do we make sense of these global inequalities? What are the key factors that contribute to them? Is it all about access to resources, or are there deeper, more systemic issues at play?
That's a big question, and one we'll continue to unpack as we dive deeper into this topic.
Yeah.
But for now, I think it's important for our listener to consider how these global inequalities impact their own lives, even if they're not directly experiencing poverty or hardship.
What are the connections between our own consumer choices, our economic policies, and the lives of people in other parts of the world? How can we, as individuals and as a society, contribute to a more just and equitable world?
Those are questions worth pondering as we continue our exploration of social stratification. And in our next segment, we'll delve into some of the major theoretical perspectives that attempt to explain why these inequalities exist and how they function within societies.
Okay, sounds good.
It's going to be a fascinating journey into the heart of what makes societies tick and how those mechanisms can either promote equality or perpetuate inequality.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into social stratification. Last time we were exploring the different layers of society from the upper crust to the working class, and even zoomed out to a global view.
It's a complicated landscape, that's for sure.
But now I'm really curious, why does this whole stratification thing exist in the first place? Is it just human nature? Or are there deeper forces at play?
That's where those theoretical perspectives come in. They're like different lenses we can use to examine this complex system.
Right.
Remember those three big perspectives from the chapter: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism.
Right. It's like putting on different pairs of glasses.
Ah.
Same reality, but you see it through a different lens.
Exactly.
But functionalism, these folks are all about the big picture.
Right.
They see society as a complex machine with each part playing a specific role.
Exactly. And they argue that even social stratification, as unequal as it seems, actually serves a function in maintaining social order.
Okay, so even inequality has a purpose. How does that work?
They'd point to the Davis-Moore thesis, which suggests that inequality is necessary to motivate people to fill those important roles that require a lot of training and skill.
Okay, so the promise of higher pay and prestige is what drives people to become doctors, lawyers,
Right.
or even podcast hosts. It's like a built-in incentive system for society.
Exactly.
But doesn't that assume everyone has an equal shot at those high-paying, prestigious roles? I mean, talent and drive aren't exactly evenly distributed across all social classes, are they?
That's one of the limitations of the functionalist perspective. It doesn't always acknowledge the systemic barriers that prevent certain groups from accessing those opportunities, even if they have the talent and the drive. It's like saying everyone has an equal chance to win a race, even if some runners are starting a mile behind the starting line.
Right. And what about those essential jobs that don't get a lot of respect or pay, like teachers, nurses, or social workers? They're crucial for society to function, but they're not exactly raking in the big bucks. Doesn't that poke a few holes in the functionalist theory?
It does. That's a major critique. Functionalism can sometimes overlook the inherent unfairness baked into these systems.
Okay.
It doesn't always address the fact that social value and economic reward don't always align. And it certainly doesn't explain things like discrimination, where your social standing is determined by factors like race or gender, not just your skills or contributions to society.
Okay, so functionalism has its limitations. What about conflict theory? They seem to take a more confrontational approach.
Definitely. Conflict theorists see social stratification as a giant power struggle.
Yeah.
It's all about the haves versus the have-nots and how those in power maintain their control and exploit those with less power.
So it's like that game of Monopoly, where one player manages to buy up all the properties and then charges everyone else exorbitant rent until they go bankrupt.
That's a great analogy, and they often trace this back to Karl Marx, the OG conflict theorist, who saw capitalism as inherently creating this conflict between the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, and the proletariat, the workers. He believed that this power imbalance would inevitably lead to revolution and the overthrow of the capitalist system.
So it's not just about income inequality. It's about the fundamental power dynamics that shape our society and determine who benefits and who gets left behind.
Exactly. And while Marx's ideas were developed in the 19th century, conflict theorists argue that many of those same dynamics are still at play today, even if the forms of exploitation have evolved.
Like what kinds of exploitation?
Think about things like globalization, where corporations can exploit cheap labor in developing countries.
Right.
Or the gig economy, where workers lack the protections and benefits of traditional employment.
It makes you wonder if the American dream is even possible in a system where the rules are rigged to benefit those at the top. It's like trying to climb a ladder that's constantly being pulled up by those who are already at the top. Okay,
Right.
so functionalism and conflict theory offer these big picture views of social stratification. What about symbolic interactionism? How do they approach this issue?
Symbolic interactionism zooms in on the everyday interactions that reflect and reinforce social stratification. They're fascinated by how we use symbols like clothing cars or even language to communicate our social standing.
So it's about the messages we send and receive, often without even realizing it. Like how the brand of your jeans or the way you pronounce certain words can signal your social class. It's fascinating how these seemingly small things can carry so much weight in our social interactions.
Exactly. And symbolic interactionists would argue that these symbols aren't just about appearances. They shape our perceptions of ourselves and others. They influence our expectations, our opportunities, and even our sense of self-worth.
So it's not just about material possessions.
Right.
It's about the meaning we attach to those possessions and how those meanings are constructed and reinforced through our social interactions. It's like how a certain type of handbag might be seen as a status symbol, even if it's functionally no different from a less expensive bag.
Exactly. And those status symbols can change over time and across cultures.
Interesting.
What's considered high class in one context might be seen as tacky or outdated in another. It's all about the shared meanings we create and the social codes we navigate.
So symbolic interactionism helps us understand how social stratification plays out in those subtle everyday interactions shaping our identities and our perceptions of the world around us. It's like a secret language that we're all learning and speaking, even if we're not consciously aware of the grammar rules.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights how deeply embedded social stratification is in our culture and our consciousness. It's not just about economic inequality. It's about a whole set of beliefs, values, and practices that reinforce those inequalities.
Okay, so we've got these three theoretical lenses: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Each offers a unique perspective on why social stratification exists and how it operates within society. But how do these theories help us understand the real-world consequences of social stratification? Is it all just abstract academic jargon, or can these theories actually inform our understanding of issues like poverty, inequality, and social mobility?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore in our next segment. We'll move from theory to practice, examining how social stratification plays out in different areas of life, like education, healthcare, and even the criminal justice system.
Sounds like we're about to get even deeper into those hidden layers of society.
Yay.
I'm ready to peel back the curtain and see what we find. But for now, I'm curious what stands out to our listeners so far. Which of these theoretical perspectives resonates most with your understanding of the world? And how do you see these ideas playing out in your own Dublin life? Keep those questions in mind as we continue our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into social stratification. We've been talking about how society is structured like a giant invisible game board, right? With some players starting off with way better odds than others. We've looked at the different class systems, those layers of society. And we even zoomed out to a global view. And of course, we explored some of the big theories that try to explain why this whole thing exists. But now let's get down to brass tacks. How does this actually play out in our everyday lives? Yeah, it's like these hidden currents that are shaping the flow of a river. You might not see them, but they're directing where everything goes. We've got these systems and structures, often invisible, that either reinforce those pre-existing advantages or make it even harder for folks to break free from their starting position.
So it's not just about bad luck or not working hard enough.
Right.
There are actual systems in place that make it easier for some people to succeed while others keep hitting roadblocks, even if they're putting in the same effort.
Exactly. It's like trying to run a race where some runners are wearing lead shoes. And to make it even more complicated, these systems are all interconnected. They impact each other and create this complex web that can be tough to untangle.
So where do we even begin to untangle this web? What are some of the key systems that are most responsible for creating and perpetuating social stratification?
Well, it might seem obvious, but the economic system is a huge factor. And in much of the world today, that system is capitalism.
Okay, so capitalism. We all know the basics, right? Private ownership, free markets, the pursuit of profit.
Mm.
But how does that connect to social stratification? Is it inherently unfair, or does it depend on how it's implemented? I mean, capitalism has led to incredible innovation and economic growth, but it's also created massive inequality.
That's the big debate, isn't it? At its core, capitalism thrives on competition.
Right.
And while that competition can be a powerful engine for innovation, it also inevitably creates winners and losers.
So some people accumulate wealth and power, while others struggle to make ends meet, even if they're working just as hard. It's like that saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
And to make matters worse, those advantages are often passed down through generations. Think about inheritance laws, tax policies, and even access to education and healthcare. These things can create a cycle of inequality that's incredibly difficult to break.
It's not just about individual effort. It's about the rules of the game being tilted in favor of certain groups. It's like playing Monopoly, where some players start with extra money and get to roll the dice twice.
That's a great analogy. And conflict theorists would argue that this tilt is intentional,
Okay.
that the system is designed to benefit those at the top, even if it comes at the expense of those at the bottom. They see capitalism as inherently exploitative, with the owners of capital profiting off the labor of workers.
It's like a built-in power imbalance, where those with the resources and capital have the upper hand, and those without are stuck trying to catch up. So if capitalism is a major driver of social stratification, what about other systems? What about things like government policies, education, or even healthcare? Can't those systems help level the playing field?
They absolutely can. These systems have the potential to either reinforce or mitigate the effects of capitalism depending on how they're structured.
Okay, give us some examples. How can these systems either help or hinder social mobility?
Take education, for example. In a society with a strong public education system, everyone has the opportunity to develop their skills and knowledge regardless of their background. That can help close the achievement gap and create more pathways to success for those who might otherwise be left behind.
It's like providing everyone with a sturdy pair of running shoes, even if they didn't have the resources to buy them themselves. It levels the playing field and gives everyone a fairer shot at winning the race. But what happens when the education system itself is unequal? What if the quality of your education is determined by your zip code or your family's income?
Then you have a system that perpetuates inequality instead of dismantling it. Children from wealthy families get access to better schools, more resources, and experienced teachers, while children from low-income families are often stuck in underfunded schools that struggle to provide even the basics.
So instead of being a ladder to climb, education becomes another barrier, reinforcing those existing inequalities.
Exactly.
It's like giving some runners a head start while others are still lacing up their shoes. And I imagine the same dynamics play out in other systems like healthcare.
Absolutely. If access to quality healthcare is tied to employment or income, then those who are already disadvantaged are more likely to experience poor health outcomes. And that can have ripple effects impacting their ability to work, their education, and even their overall well-being.
It's like this vicious cycle where disadvantage leads to further disadvantage.
Right.
You get sick because you can't afford healthcare.
Well,
Then you can't afford healthcare because you're too sick to work. It's a heartbreaking reality for so many people. So we've got these big systems like economics, education, and healthcare all interacting and impacting each other. But what about those more subtle, everyday ways that social stratification manifests? What about things like social networks, cultural capital, and even taste?
those factors can be just as powerful as any structural barrier. Think about social networks, who you know and the connections you have. Those networks can open doors to opportunities that might otherwise be inaccessible.
Right. It's like that saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. If your parents are well connected in a certain industry, you might have an easier time getting internships, job offers, or even mentorship. It's like having a VIP pass to the inner circle.
Exactly. And that advantage isn't necessarily based on merit, it's based on social capital, the resources and benefits that come from your social connections. It's like having a built-in network of support and guidance.
And then there's cultural capital, which is like this currency in certain social circles. It's about having the knowledge, skills, and tastes that are valued by those in power.
It's about knowing how to navigate those unspoken rules,
Yeah.
understanding the social codes, and having the right cultural toolkit.
Like knowing how to dress for a job interview, being familiar with certain authors or artists, or even having the right accent.
Exactly.
It can all signal your belonging to a particular social class. It's like speaking the language of the elite, even if you haven't been immersed in that world from birth.
Exactly. And if you don't have that cultural capital, you might be judged or excluded, even if you have the same qualifications or abilities as someone who does. It's like showing up to a party where everyone's speaking a language you don't understand. You might feel out of place, even if you're dressed appropriately and have something interesting to contribute.
So social stratification isn't just about money or material possessions. It's about this whole set of social, cultural, and even psychological factors that shape our experiences, our opportunities, and even our perceptions of ourselves. It's like this invisible script that we're all following, even if we're not aware of the stage directions.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the insidious nature of social stratification. It's not always about overt discrimination or intentional exclusion. It's often about those subtle cues, those unspoken rules, and those ingrained biases that shape our perceptions and our interactions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into social stratification, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do we want them to remember as they navigate this complex and often unfair world?
Well, the first takeaway is that social stratification is real, it's pervasive, and it impacts us all. It's not just about income or wealth, it's about access to resources, opportunities, and even power. And it manifests in both obvious and subtle ways, shaping everything from our education to our healthcare to our social interactions.
It's like this force field that surrounds us, influencing our choices or opportunities and even our beliefs about ourselves and the world. So what can we do about it? Is it even possible to break free from this system? Or are we all just pawns in a game we can't control?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. But I think the first step is awareness. We need to understand how social stratification operates, how it impacts us, and how we might be complicit in perpetuating it.
So it starts with education, but like shining a light on those hidden systems and those unspoken rules.
Exactly.
With challenging our own assumptions and biases.
Exactly. And then we can start to make more conscious choices, both in our own lives and in the policies we support. We can advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources, or for policies that promote social mobility, and for a culture that values diversity and inclusion.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their starting position on that invisible game board. It's about dismantling those systems of oppression and creating a more just and equitable society for all. It's tall order, but I believe it's possible.
I do too. It starts with each of us, with questioning those layers, challenging those assumptions, and committing to creating a world where everyone has a fair shot.
So to our listeners, keep diving deep. Keep questioning those layers.
Yeah.
Keep pushing for change. And keep believing that a better world is possible. Until next time, keep exploring.